Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm happy that you are here. So the topic of my paper is also monetary theory. We go a step back in the history of economic thought from Mises, Rothbard, and Salerno to their predecessors, namely Karl Menger and Friedrich von Wieser. Of course, the main motivation to work on this paper for me was to think a bit more about Karl Menger and his many contributions to economic theory and economic science, since, as you all know, as you have heard in earlier panels of this conference, this year marks the 150th anniversary of the Principles of Economics, his founding book of the Austrian school. And you have heard a lot about his contributions already at this conference. My focus here is somewhat narrower, so I want to look at monetary theory first of all, and I want to compare his framework for monetary theory with the one of Friedrich von Wieser. And there is a little bit more of a background story to this paper. Last year, two co-authors and I published a paper in the European Journal of the History of Economic Thought that deals with many similar themes. We, in this paper, argue that you can interpret Mises as standing firmly in the tradition of Menger, and Wieser as being somewhat of a deviation from Menger, and Hayek standing more in the tradition of Wieser when it comes to the notion and the use of the concept of neutral money in monetary theory. Already in that paper, we point out and we highlight that there is a bit of a nuance there. It's not that easy. It's not that clear cut. There is a way in which you can interpret Wieser as, well, building on the theory of Menger and actually resolving a tension or somewhat of a contradiction in Menger's framework. But we only hint at this in the paper, and we do not develop this very much. We do not explain exactly why there is a tension. We basically only mention it. And so this is the focus of my paper that I present today. This tension arises in the subfield or the sub-question of the value of money. I argue that Menger is somewhat contradictory, and Wieser recognized that and basically changed the conceptual framework. He got rid of the contradiction, got rid of the tension. So my paper is somewhat critical of Menger, and in this regard, I'm praising Wieser for having recognized that. But in the end, as I hope to show, Wieser, despite getting rid of the contradiction or the tension, drew overly optimistic conclusions when it comes to monetary policy, in my opinion. And Menger, even though he had this contradiction in his framework, his ultimate conclusions were more or less sound. Okay, what I do in this paper is I look at the last publications of those two authors in the area of monetary theory. Those are contained in the very important Handwörterbuch der Staatswissenschaften. Menger was the foremost monetary theorist in Vienna, in Austria at the time. He contributed the first 3 articles on money for the first 3 editions of the Handwörterbuch between 1889 and 1909. This publication by Menger, his article on Geld, on money, is not only an encyclopedia entry. It's really more like a monograph. It grew from every edition. It got larger and larger and more extensive, and it contains all the important elements of monetary theory. It gives a very good overview of the field. It was later republished in the collected works edited by Hayek, and Menger's article was also translated into English by Leland Jäger. So that's accessible to an international audience. On the other hand, Friedrich Wieser's article, published in 1926 in the 4th edition of the Handwörterbuch on Geld, on monetary theory, was never published into English, so it's not accessible to an international audience, and it wasn't contained in the collective works by Wieser, edited by Hayek again. So I don't think that this article is very well known. But this too is an extremely important article by Wieser. He himself called it his ökonomische Schlussarbeit, his closing work on economics. So he has seen it as being very important for himself. It was published in the same year that he died. Actually, the publication of the Handwörterbuch was just a couple of weeks after he passed away. And he couldn't give the final touches to the article. It was Hans Meyer who did the final editing. But I compare these two texts because they are very similar, they cover the same issue, and they are both sort of the most elaborate expositions of their monetary theories. After a lifetime of reflection on the topic, this is what they came up with. Okay, let's look into Menger's work. As I said, the contradiction as I see it, or the tension, arises when it comes to the question of the value of money. And Menger introduces the twin notion of the outer and the inner exchange value of money. So the outer exchange value of money refers to basically money prices for goods and services. That is what the outer exchange value of money is. You could call it the purchasing power of money, or it is what money can buy you in real terms on the markets. The second notion, the inner exchange value, is added to the framework to cope with the problem or with the fact that any given change in prices can arise potentially from two sources. It can arise from changes on the money side of the equation and from changes on the goods side of the equation. Okay? And the distinction did not come from Menger personally. He was not the economist who came up with it, but he incorporated this notion from the British classical economists into his own work. He references Robert Malthus twice in the article, and he also references Alfred Marshall as a neoclassical economist who used this idea. So the idea is that any price change can be due to changes in supply and demand for money, or because of changes in supply and demand for the good. So those are the two sides of the equation, and they can influence money prices on the market. So Menger then points out, and he's very, very clear on this, there is no way of bringing about a money that has a stable outer exchange value. It's impossible. Many economists have thought about this problem, but it just can't be done. It's impossible. Okay? There's no way of doing it. A dynamic economy requires that the outer exchange value changes as well. This is just implied by a dynamic economy. But then he goes on to say that it is not inconceivable to have a good with a stable inner exchange value, to have a money with stable inner exchange value. He says it cannot arise on the free market, but potentially we could have wise regulation and government management and intervention into the monetary sphere to bring such a good about. It's very difficult, but it is not inconceivable. He calls the quest for a stable outer exchange value an economic squaring of the circle, but the inner exchange value could be stabilized. And that's the tension, that's the contradiction as I see it, because when you place this into the broader framework of Menger, into his value theory and price theory, you see that this distinction of inner and outer exchange value is somewhat artificial. Menger makes very clear that a value is ordinal and value is expressed always in relation to some other thing. So the value of a good is expressed in relation to the value of something else. In a monetary exchange, we value a good relative to the value of certain sums of money. And he's very, very explicit in his overall exposition of monetary theory that any supply of a good corresponds also to a demand for money, and any demand for money or some types of demand for money correspond to supplies of goods. They are two sides of the same coin. They are indistinguishable conceptually. There's a money price for goods and services, and there is a goods price for money. So when you think about it now, you have an increase in the demand for money. You could interpret this as being a change from the money side of the equation. Right? An increase in the demand for money will lower the prices, ceteris paribus. But it goes hand in hand with either a reduced demand for goods and services. Well, when you increase the reservation demand, as Christopher laid out in his talk, your cash balance demand for money, you spend less money on goods and services. It's just equivalent to saying that you reduce your demand for goods and services. So then you might ask the question, so from which side does the cause come? For all practical intents and purposes, we cannot distinguish the two in the real world. And Menger goes at length through the practical complications of actually bringing about a money good with stable inner exchange value, and then ultimately says, yeah, it's probably too difficult to do. Wieser himself sees the contradiction. He explicitly refers to Menger indirectly as being the representative of the dominant tradition in monetary theory, and then he explicitly rejects it. It's very interesting. It's evidence that Wieser himself saw his work as being a deviation from Menger. But he got rid of the inner and outer exchange value and focused on what he calls in his framework the economy-wide objective exchange value of money, so basically just the purchasing power or the outer exchange value, right? He would say that actually inner and outer exchange value coincide, they collapse into one thing. It's indistinguishable, and it's not really important from which side the change comes. What is important is only the effect of the change. And the important thing is what happens afterwards when prices change. And any price change in Wieser's view is potentially disturbing for an economy, and so it is always preferable to have a stabler economy-wide objective exchange value of money than a less stable one. And he takes up another element from Menger. Menger himself hints at this when he thinks about or reflects on the possibility of bringing about a money good with stable inner exchange value. He says that in a modern financial system where we have fiduciary elements, fractional reserve banking, some of it happens automatically. The banking system, by creating unbacked media of exchange, money substitutes, can sort of push the money into the direction of having a stable inner exchange value. And Wieser is much more optimistic on this point and says, yeah, of course, yeah, we can do this if we allow for fractional reserve banking. If we have in such a situation an increase in the needs for media of exchange, it will automatically bring about an additional supply of it. So basically, it is possible then in the conceptual framework of Wieser to neutralize any change that comes from the money side automatically. When the demand for money increases, the supply of it will increase as well. And so the economy-wide objective exchange value would be stabilized. Wieser explains the value of money not in terms of demand and supply. This is also very important and a big difference in the conceptual frameworks. What Wieser says is that demand and supply do not apply in the same way for money as they do for goods and services. When money comes into existence in an economy, it separates the acts of buying and selling, and it separates the acts of demanding and supplying. Somebody who sells a good is not at the same time demanding money, but the person just wants to use money to then demand what he actually wants. I think it is a bit of semantics, it's not all that important, but how Wieser then explains the value of money is by saying, well, it is determined by the gap between the nominal income, the money income in an economy, and the real income. Okay, and you might argue this is somewhat circular, because the nominal income, is measurable, right? You can see it's just a sum of money that was spent on certain goods and services, but how do you get to the notion of real income without already having the price level or the economy-wide objective exchange value of money? So that's problematic. Ultimately, when it comes to the conclusions, they are very close when it comes to the practical conclusions for the monetary system. Menger says, well, because we are limited in our knowledge, it might potentially be possible to bring about a money with stable inner exchange value. We don't have the capability now, so it's better to have a gold-backed money with some fiduciary elements to come closer to a stable inner exchange value of money. Wieser gives his hypothetical ideal of a one-world paper money, which would be the best thing to have. It's preferable over a gold standard system because we could always then politically push the money even closer to being of a neutral value. But the reason why he does not recommend it for practical monetary policies in the interwar period was to suggest that, well, as long as there's no world peace, we better have money, we better have gold, we better have a gold anchor in the monetary system to stabilize the exchange values between monies and the international markets. The problem here is, of course, that this is too optimistic. Wars are not the only problem that we can have. And as long as we have, we could imagine a peaceful world with a one paper money worldwide, the institutional setup of this would bring about many other problems. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I stop here because I'm running out of time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, we technically don't have time for questions anyways. So
Okay.
I have a brief question.
Sure.
So do you think that Hayek's later ideas about competing currencies, competing fiat currency should be, or can be understood as like a derivative of Wieser's monetary theory? Or is this too far outside your...
I'm sure there are many commonalities, common points between Hayek and Wieser. This particular point, I'd say, is more of an acknowledgement of the political economic problems that you would have if you had one paper money in the world, like the moral hazard that comes with it, the systemic risk that might emanate from that moral hazard. And so Hayek realized that and suggested that a competitive system would be better. It would sort of restrain this moral hazard to some extent.
Okay. We'll move on to the next.